Very much for coming in, especially on a Friday evening, and I'm sure braving Bangalore's traffic, as everyone has probably got used to now. Probably the people watching the live streams are saved of that, and we are looking forward to a wider participation. It gives me real pleasure to introduce Professor Jeremy Weber, and whom I met a couple of years ago at the University of Victoria, where he was Dean of Law. And I'm sure you all would have seen this on the website, so I'm sort of reading off this, but I also in conversation, and maybe I should do it that way, because this is something kind of a brief which you can always get back to, but Jeremy is an old India person in a sense that this is his 7th visit, and he first came in 1977, just as the election results were being declared, and then again in 2009. But several visits, and also learned Hindi for a couple of months. Don't try to speak. So in a sense, kind of a deeper engagement, and I think that's one of the connections. We met in Sarai event in 2012, where this was a set of artistic productions which were, in a sense, dealing with how one could look at cities in multiple ways and through a kind of density of practice logic. And that's something that drew me to Jeremy's work through the lens of legal pluralism. And I think one of the things that has struck me in the write-up, but also knowing his work, especially the grammar of customary law, which I've drawn on extensively, not just in my writing, but in teaching, and where several generations of students found it illuminating to shape their own thinking about, especially on land issues, customary land issues in cities like Chennai and Bangalore and elsewhere, Kozhikode in Kerala, is to look at how one needs to take seriously ways and practices in which legal orders get embedded in society, and how do various parts of the state get reconstituted through this process. That is something that I personally have found very interesting. And I think the second point is that this process is at some time illegible, it's ambiguous, and constantly in work and play. So it's constantly getting played out, and in a sense to look at it as a kind of ongoing political space which is subject to negotiation, where sometimes fixity might actually kill politics. So these are the kind of main points. I won't take too much time because I think there'll be more questions and discussions. But I'll just like to thank Jeremy and hand the floor to him. Okay. I don't know, maybe the mic is working? I think this one. I'll just turn off this one.
Well, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back in Bengaluru, and I'm looking forward very much to the conversation. Sully says that I've come back to India. I don't see myself as being a specialist in India, but what I have found is that the kinds of questions that I work on in the Canadian case or the Australian case, where I've also spent a lot of time, benefits greatly from interacting with scholars who are thinking about the Indian context and comparable situations in India. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion to follow. So the paper that I'm presenting really asks, how should we think about the question of sovereignty when dealing with the interaction between non-Indigenous governments, the governments that are the result of the establishment of settler societies, especially in Canada, and resurgence of Indigenous self-government within the Canadian context. And so what I'll do, my talk will really fall into two parts. In the first part, which I'll try to keep fairly brief, I'll give you a sense of the context of how the discussion, how the notion of sovereignty has arisen in the Canadian context and how it's been discussed within the Canadian context. But the real heart of the talk will be the second part, and it will be about how we should think about sovereignty in this context. And what it does is it essentially argues that we tend to take a bundle of different characteristics and roll them together in our understanding of sovereignty, as though they were one single concept. But as I'll try to persuade you, there's at least 5 different conceptions of sovereignty that are operative in this debate, and they're worth teasing apart because they don't have to go together. And in fact, as I hope to show, treating them as though they were a single concept has in fact tripped us up and made it more difficult for us to see what is really an issue and how we might move forward on these questions. So that'll be the focus of the talk. And to begin, how did these questions arise and how has the notion of sovereignty been discussed in the Canadian context? Well, so to give a very simple story of the structural evolution of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadian governments, in the Canadian territory, one starts off with a situation where there's a period of relatively constructive interactions that occur between the newcomers and the Indigenous peoples, largely structured around the fur trade within Canadian territory. But over time, especially as agricultural settlement progressed within Canada, one began to have a decay of that economic interdependence, and you began to have a displacement of the Indigenous peoples, and over time, an imposition of a heavily bureaucratized structure of control on Indigenous peoples. A paternalistic structure at its best, a structure that sought to displace Indigenous cultures or assume that they were dying out, that they were not the wave of the future, and sought to confine and assimilate or displace them. What you then had in the beginning kind of glimmers in the 1950s, but then really picking up steam in the 1960s and 1970s, was a re-engagement with the question about whether Indigenous peoples in Canada really possess distinct rights and distinct ought to be, and that their control or their rights to the land ought to be specifically recognized. Where did that come from? Well, part of it was that the Indigenous peoples did not fade away. Indeed, what really drove that process was the assertion of the Indigenous leadership themselves, especially as constitutional processes really engaged in Canada with respect to the reform of Canadian structures of government, and Indigenous peoples insisted that their rights be dealt with productively in that process. There was also a very clear sense that Indigenous policy had not been successful, that it had caused very substantial harm in Indigenous communities, and a realization that a better way had to be found. And so you had a process of re-engagement with questions of Indigenous rights within the Canadian context that essentially took, you might say, 3 quickly overlapping stages. Initially, the dominant language in which these questions were discussed were languages that sounded as though they were about property rights, Indigenous peoples' land rights, their ability to regain control of the land. Although I think it's actually a mistake to think of those as though they are, the best analogy are property rights. Probably the best analogy, in fact, are territorial rights. It wasn't that Indigenous peoples ought to be, it wasn't so much about it was about land ownership, but It was really about the reestablishment of Indigenous jurisdiction over the lands so that those lands could be administered in a way that retained the features of and the tenures that were appropriate in the Indigenous legal order, Indigenous legal orders themselves. The second that really worked off of that land question was a modern treaty process, which really was engaged with the first of those major land claims agreements that was adopted in the mid-1970s, the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, and that's been followed by a series of other treaties dealing with situations where the Aboriginal land title had never been dealt with by treaty previously, where historic treaties, in other words, did not exist. And that was then quickly followed by a process of constitutional negotiation, which dealt with a whole series of issues within the Canadian constitutional order. It was really driven primarily by the relationship between Quebec and the rest of Canada, but one aspect of it was a reassertion of a demand for recognition of Indigenous rights, which resulted in a provision in the 1982 Constitution Act, the constitutional settlement that emerged out of this process, that recognized the continued existence of Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. So you essentially have a movement from these assertions being discussed first through language that sounds very much like proprietary language, like the language of property, but then this moved rapidly towards a realization or an assertion by the First Nations and a realization that rights of governance were also very much an issue. And so the phrase that became the common phrase in the Canadian context for talking about these governance rights was the assertion of an inherent right of Indigenous governance on behalf of the Indigenous peoples. So my paper then is asking, are these rights of self-government usefully approached through the language of sovereignty, and if so, how? How should we understand them? Now, the question of Indigenous sovereignty, the language of sovereignty, has been used very sparingly in the official discourse within Canada. So we've had a series of constitutional negotiations over Indigenous self-government, which has generally not been successful, not resulted in constitutional amendments. And the language that has been used in that context has tended to be this language of inherent rights of self-government. There's also been an extension of rights of governance, a material extension of those rights through the modern treaty process. All of those modern treaties involve significant rights of self-government recognized as existing within, among the Indigenous peoples who are parties to those agreements. But the dominant language in which that's been discussed has not been the language of sovereignty. It's been this inherent right of self-government, or sometimes, drawing on the international discussion, self-determination. Why hasn't it been used more in that context? Well, I think the essential reason is because all parties tend to agree that what comes out of the process has to be a matter of co-determination rather than unilateral determination. And the language of sovereignty tends to connote for many people a power of unilateral determination or of final and absolute determination existing in the hands of one party. I should say the Canadian governments have especially resisted the language of sovereignty because they feel that they may be conceding a unilateral power of determination in the hands of Indigenous peoples. Nevertheless, conceptions of sovereignty have really become in many ways inescapable in this discussion. For one thing, many of the questions that theories of sovereignty try to answer, For example, what is the grounding of the legitimacy of governments? Are Indigenous governments, for example, the result of a grant of power from Canadian institutions, or do they repose upon their own sources of legitimacy? Those questions are very much tied up with questions of sovereignty, and they're very much on the table in Canada. Or the relations of precedence and subordination between Indigenous governments and Canadian governments. So the questions that sovereignty tends to direct itself towards are certainly there. And of course, there is one clear historical claim of sovereignty in these debates, and that's the claim of sovereignty of the Canadian institutions. So my sense is that sovereignty is pretty much inescapable, and indeed it has started to come up in the discourse. Especially in the discourse, well, you see it in very interesting fashion in the way in which the Supreme Court of Canada has dealt with what is an issue in the Canadian state's recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights. And the progression has gone something like this. In one of the first of the Supreme Court of Canada's decisions with respect to Aboriginal rights under the new constitutional order, the decision that occurred in 1990, the Supreme Court of Canada said this: there was from the outset never any doubt that sovereignty and legislative power was vested in the Crown. And indeed that has been the assumption, certainly of Canadian governments, for a very long time. So you have this unambiguous assertion that sovereignty is located in the institutions of Canadian government. But then we began to see something very interesting. As the court reflected over the course of a whole series of cases on what really was an issue in this constitutional recognition of Aboriginal rights, they began to cast that in terms of the need for reconciliation. Reconciliation between what? Well, the initial comments were recognition between the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies and the sovereignty of Canada, of the Canadian Crown. Or the reconciliation between the fact of prior Aboriginal occupation and the sovereignty of the Crown. Or, in one particularly interesting case, in 2004, reconciliation between the pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty, they used the word, and assumed Crown sovereignty. So you have this sense that the Canadian recognition of Aboriginal rights is about some search for an adequate resolution between the existence of autonomous Aboriginal societies, Indigenous societies at least, or in the language of the Haida case, pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty, and the governmental claims of Canadian governments. And indeed, those governmental claims, another interesting aspect was Canadian sovereignty began to accumulate some very interesting adjectives in these decisions. Right? Rather than being stated to be unambiguous Canadian sovereignty, the Haida case, for example, talked about the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. Another case talks about the asserted sovereignty of the Crown. And in fact, one case talks about the de facto sovereignty of the Crown. Now, this obviously does not amount to a full recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. Not claiming that, clearly does not do that. It's much more tentative, much more groping than that. But what does seem to be clear is that there is a sense in this language that the court is developing that somehow Canadian sovereignty is imperfect. Because it's somehow tainted because of the lack of an adequate reconciliation with the existence of autonomous Indigenous societies, and the need to find some way of achieving a resolution that deals with that imperfection and establishes Canadian institutions on a robust foundation for both non-Indigenous and Indigenous Canadians. Now, we don't yet know the shape of that reconciliation. Indeed, if you think of it as a matter of co-determination, you can't know the shape of that reconciliation prior to the discussion occurring. And we're very much in the midst of that discussion, hence the title. We're still in the age of encounter. And indeed, there's a strong argument that we will never get beyond the age of encounter. That this co-determination is not just a process limited in time, but it is a continuing relationship that should be seen to be at the foundation of the Canadian political order. And so it seems to me no doubt, especially when you see the kind of groping tendency in the Supreme Court of Canada's decisions, that what parties are attempting to do is try to understand the nature of this encounter and to try to search for principles, structures, solutions that are adequate to that situation. And so we very much are still in the age of encounter between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And to open our minds to the possibilities that might come from that, let me use one very striking example. It's a statute of the legislature of the province of British Columbia, the province where I reside. So a statute of the entity that, according to Canadian constitutional law, exercises the provincial share of sovereignty within the Canadian constitutional order in the territory of British Columbia. And it's the statute's called the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act. And what it does is it establishes a land management structure for Haida Gwaii, which used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands. In fact, the statute also renames the Queen Charlotte Islands Haida Gwaii, which is the name that the Haida Nation have for that territory. There are a set of islands, two of them very large islands, that are off the north coast of British Columbia. And what that statute does is it takes an agreement that was made between the Haida Nation and the province of British Columbia with respect to how the lands and resources of Haida Gwaii are to be managed, and translates it into statutory form for the province of British Columbia. And in the preamble to the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act, the words that lead up to the operative sections of the Act, in the fifth recital in that preamble, you find the following. So this is from 2010, and as you'll see it, notice what it says. Whereas the Constaya Reconciliation Protocol, that's the agreement that was concluded between the Haida Nation and British Columbia, provides that the Haida Nation and British Columbia, now get this, hold differing views. What do they differ on? Sovereignty, title, ownership, and jurisdiction over Haida Gwaii. Under the protocol, the Haida Nation and British Columbia will never, I like adding the word nevertheless, I think that's essentially what it means, will nevertheless operate under their respective authorities and jurisdictions in putting in place the following land management scheme. So essentially what the preamble says is, the parties agree to disagree on who holds ultimate sovereignty, on who holds property rights in this area, on who has jurisdiction. Nevertheless, each of us, in accordance with our own authorities and jurisdictions, agree to put in place the following land management scheme. And in fact, the protocol itself is even more striking because it sets out the differing positions in 2 columns, right? Indicating what the Haida nation asserts, that Haida Gwaii is Haida lands, including waters and resources, subject to the rights, sovereignty, ownership, jurisdiction, and collective title of the Haida nation, who will manage Haida Gwaii in accordance with its laws, policies, customs, and traditions. And then in this agreement, you have the acknowledgement of the British Columbia side. Haida Gwaii is Crown land, subject to certain private rights or interests, and subject to the sovereignty of Her Majesty the Queen and the legislative jurisdiction of the Parliament of Canada and the legislature of the province of British Columbia. And I have to say, this recognition, well, in the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act, in an act of the legislature of British Columbia, of these differing views on something so fundamental as sovereignty and ownership is quite remarkable. And yet, see then what happens. The parties decide, each in accordance with their own authorities and traditions to proceed with and jurisdictions to proceed with the establishment of this structure. And in fact, this is where the term, this is what I'm referring to in the title when I refer to agonistic constitutionalism. The ability to include with it, we constitutional lawyers have a professional deformation, right? We tend to think that you have to establish first principles first and then build everything else on top of them. Here you see profound differences on first principles that are acknowledged, bracketed, and then one proceeds to do the work of government together through collective co-determination. And that bracketing of foundational questions that we constitutional lawyers tend to get stuck on, think that you can't get beyond until you resolve them, actually I think is much more common in the way constitutions work than we often think. Okay, so we'll come back to the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act, but what I want to do now then is turn to, okay, if we are going to think about sovereignty in this context, what are we talking about when we talk about sovereignty? And as I say, often we talk about too many things within that one concept, and so I pull apart 5 different conceptions of sovereignty that I want to talk about. Here are the 5, and starting with the first, ultimate and absolute power of decision. Now this, I think, will be the notion of sovereignty that will be most familiar to you. I think it actually comes to most folks most quickly when they think about sovereignty. The idea of the final power to make the final repository, the ultimate repository of absolute governmental responsibility within a society. Or, as the British constitutional lawyer said, the right to make or unmake any right whatever. Supreme legislative power. Now, this has undeniably played an important role in the discussion. In fact, it's this conception of sovereignty which is one of the main reasons why Canadian authorities are so reluctant to talk about it. It just seems, because it seems to insist upon sovereignty being located in one single place. And it's certainly the case that this kind of sovereignty is unlikely to be acknowledged in Indigenous peoples, except perhaps with respect to the internal affairs of Indigenous peoples. So it has played a role, but a role of a stumbling block, essentially, in these discussions. One might say that it has, over time, though, been restricted. One could argue that the constitutional recognition of Aboriginal rights was in some ways an auto-limitation by the Canadian state of its own sovereignty. Now, a Sovereignty One theorist, a theorist who really insisted that Sovereignty One is what we're talking about and it's always there, would say, you're just fooling yourself. There's always sovereignty lurking in the background. To tell you the truth, I'm not at all certain that that's true. I think that Sovereignty One, in fact, is much less of a living reality in constitutional orders than we constitutional lawyers tend to think. And in fact, I actually think that it may have, there may be very good reasons why it's so limited. And let me just sketch two ways in which that's the case. So a Sovereignty One theorist might say, the reason why Sovereignty One still exists is because, of course, the Canadian institutions could always amend the Constitution to get rid of that provision. And that might be true, but what would happen then? First, would you have more effective Canadian government? What you would certainly have would be Indigenous peoples who would say something along the lines of, that's it. We are recognizing that the institutions of the Canadian state have no legitimacy whatsoever. You pay no regard whatsoever with our rights. How can we see this institution as being, these set of institutions as being any way justifying our respect and our obedience? So from the practical side, you can ask yourself whether that would make the operation of Canadian government any easier. My guess is the answer is no. That would in fact be a debilitating development in Canadian process. And even if the Canadian authorities decided to proceed regardless and force it through, would you have, at least with respect to the Indigenous peoples, the Canadian government possessing this form of sovereignty? Sovereignty, I think that no one would want to think sovereignty was about sheer force. The notion of sovereignty implies a claim of right, entitlement to be the ultimate legislative arbiter. And if the Canadian government simply overran any possibility of Indigenous rights, you would not have that with respect to Indigenous peoples. We would be, without a doubt, in a position of a frankly colonial position with respect to the Indigenous peoples, with them subjected by force to the rule of the Canadian institutions. So Sovereignty One looks to be this immensely powerful claim of right. But faced with peoples who see their foundation of legitimacy quite differently, an insistence on Sovereignty One might in fact be self-defeating. It certainly wouldn't constitute sovereignty in any kind of claim of right way with respect to the Indigenous peoples. Okay, second form of sovereignty, status as a state in international law. This too is a way in which we very commonly use the language of sovereignty. It has sometimes cropped up, or kind of this nature of sovereignty has sometimes colored the discussion. For example, there was for some time a real question about whether the treaties that were concluded between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state involved some kind of international law consequences. And in fact, that was dodged by the courts by saying that they're actually sui generis. They're neither ordinary contracts nor international treaties, treaty between international states. But in fact, international legal status as states tends not to be claimed by Indigenous peoples in Canada. There has been times when the Mohawk have claimed that, but that's very unusual. They do Indigenous peoples in Canada do seek recognition as peoples in international law, but not with full state sovereignty. With the self-determination that tends to be sought is internal self-determination. So this is worth keeping one's mind to, but in fact, it tends not to be a critical element in the debate. The third is, in fact, just to kind of foreshadow the conclusion, this is in fact the kind of sovereignty that I think is really an issue between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. So if one's recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, it's recognizing sovereignty in terms of Sovereignty 3. And what is Sovereignty 3? It's the idea that law and associated governmental rights originate from within the people's own tradition, so that the foundational legitimacy of law and governance lies within the Indigenous people's own political and legal traditions. It has an autochthonous origin. It is not, its foundation is not a grant from another party. It is a kind of self-authorizing power of governance and regulation. And so Sovereignty 3 is about sovereignty in that sense, that the foundational justification, the impetus, the authorization for the exercise of law and governance comes from within the people itself. And that, I think, is very much what Indigenous peoples are claiming. If you look at the language in which they tend to express their claims, and some examples are given in the paper from which I'm speaking, it's clear they're talking about law springing from within. And think back to the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act. There too, they're talking about each party exercising its powers in accordance with its own authorities and jurisdiction. The same idea, their powers are springing from within. And note another interesting thing about that fact in the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act. It is separable from Sovereignty 1. If you think about that Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act, both parties say they're acting in accordance with their own institutional authorization and their own customs and traditions. But they do not say, and we have final power of determination over you too. Right? In fact, or at least if they do say that, that does not conform to their actions. They're acknowledging that each side claims its own sovereignty, and to the extent that they can live together, well, the language they use is the language of Sovereignty 3, and they don't insist upon a final power of determination over the other, at least not in that particular transaction, that particular interest. This too, I think, also makes the best sense of what the courts are groping for. Remember, the language they use sounds as though it recognizes that Canadian sovereignty is in some way imperfect, de facto, until reconciliation is achieved. And I think what you can see is, what's an issue there is the courts realize that Canadian institutions will not rest on a stable foundation of legitimacy, at least with respect to Indigenous peoples, until they manage to establish legitimacy not only in terms of the pedigree of the colonial origin institutions, but also that the Canadian institutions also repose upon a second stem of legitimacy, acknowledgement, acceptance by the Indigenous peoples themselves on the basis of their political traditions. So you can see that challenge of recognition as being broadening the foundations of the legitimacy of Canadian institutions so that they no longer repose simply upon the support of the non-Indigenous population and non-Indigenous constitutional traditions, but also find a footing in Indigenous acknowledgement in Indigenous political traditions. Again, Sovereignty 3 attempting to operate in a way that brackets, marginalizes a claim of sovereignty one, but instead tries to be inclusive in the establishment of the foundations of legitimacy to include both originating sources of law as the foundation of the structure. And that, I think, is the essential claim that we're dealing with in this engagement between Indigenous governments and non-Indigenous governments. It really is about finding our way towards recognizing that each party, that Canada can be built upon, we can somehow reach a situation where its legitimacy reposes not upon simply the non-Indigenous political traditions, but it can also draw upon the support and legitimacy of Indigenous legal traditions as well, through securing constitutional settlement that is acceptable to the Indigenous peoples. You'll see there are two more conceptions of sovereignty, and I'll say a little more about them because they're, I think, actually quite interesting. The next is sovereignty as a unified and rationalized order of law. This probably, I confess, is the least idiomatic of the uses of sovereignty, but I actually think it plays a bigger role than we think. And what we mean by this is sovereignty as sovereignty presuming that a legal order has to be knit together in a comprehensive, cohesive, coherent, rationally, logically ordered structure. With final mechanisms of determination of its content in order to maintain that rationality. In fact, I think this has often been operative in this context. Well, to give you an idea, first I should say why I think this still is packed into sovereignty. If a state lacked that ability, if its legal system was incoherent, it was not knit together, things happened that did not fit with the overarching structure of law and governance in that society, and the state could do nothing about it, I think we would not think of it as being sovereign. Sovereignty assumes this kind of ability to control the entirety of the legal context. But Indigenous societies tend not to be knit together in such a fashion. They tend to be much more decentralized in the distribution of authority within them. They tend to operate through more elusive and less forceful mechanisms. They tend to be more tolerant of the continuation of a diversity of views on law in the long term. They are non-state societies, to put it another way. And in fact, I think many of the reasons why, for example, there was a long debate about whether Indigenous peoples even had law is because there was a presumption that law had to conform to sovereignty to even exist. Even though Indigenous peoples were clearly exercising control over lands, defining who had the right to use those lands, passing those lands on from one generation to another. All of the work of law was being done within these. So it's more, I think, a failure of our imagination as kind of state-minded constitutional lawyers than a failure of the possibilities of human organization. And then the last is one that those of you who have read a lot of contemporary political theory will recognize is now associated with Carl Schmitt, the idea of sovereignty as, but actually for many of us, I don't know whether there are any monarchists in the audience, I suspect not, but monarchy really is the epitome of this notion of sovereignty. The idea that the monarch really personifies the whole society, embodies the society, incarnates the political community. But Carl Schmitt, legal theorist of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, whose work I have to say I resist strongly, but his conception of sovereignty, that sovereignty ought to be unified in the hands of one individual who really embodies the authority of the whole state, who stands, represents the whole society. Why does Carl Schmitt say that? Because it emphasizes unity rather than division. It emphasizes the ability to make decisions, forceful decisions, now, right? It emphasizes the responsibility of doing that. Well, that, even if one feels as I do, that that conception of political representation is very damaging, and Carl Schmitt was a supporter of what became the German political order of the 1940s, you can see that that still is a conception of sovereignty, of political legitimacy that appeals to some people these days. In fact, there's a Pierre Rosanvallon, the French political theorist, uses that concept really, I think rightly, to capture a lot of the new populism. The idea that it's debilitating to recognize all of this diversity in society. I, as the leader of the government, speak for the whole society and embody the unity of the society, and am able then to make the decisions that we have to make as a people. And we will not be debilitated by having a contending welter of voices that distract us from who we are as a people. So Sovereignty 5, I think, is one that is well worth thinking about. It actually has played a role. The kind of personification of authority has played a role, especially in the treaty process in Canadian context. So it is well worth thinking about. But one of the things I think you're beginning to see from this talk, which is almost finished, you'll be glad to know, is that 2, 4, and 5 are important, are worth considering, but aren't really where the action is. The action, when we talk about the relationship between Canadian sovereignty and the possibility of Indigenous sovereignty, is between 1 and 3. With Sovereignty 1 being the traditional stumbling block that stops us from getting past square one, and perhaps not being necessary at all, and Sovereignty 3 being something we should be taking more seriously and thinking about, and seeing whether it's something that we can work with in order to establish a constitutional order that does draw upon the legal traditions of all. And so the direction of this argument is towards talking in terms of Sovereignty 3 and realizing it can be disjoined from Sovereignty 1. And what that means in part is that it's possible for peoples to disagree about or have differing foundations of conceptions of foundational legitimacy, and nevertheless collaborate in the business of government. That agonistic constitutionalism is possible. Indeed, to tell you the truth, I think once you start asking those questions, you see agonistic constitutionalism everywhere. In any constitutional order, there are vigorous debates about foundational questions, not least about the location of sovereignty. So those of us in this room who were trained as lawyers and were therefore exposed to the British constitutional tradition will know that there was for a long time a debate over whether who's the sovereign, the monarch, Parliament, the people, with people often asserting that in fact there was sovereignty vested in all of them, perhaps in different ways. In many ways, but contending between themselves as to the balance between them. So in that sense, in fact, I think that actually agonistic constitutionalism, the ability of constitutional orders to tolerate our continued discussions over foundational questions of governmental legitimacy is in fact our usual situation, not the unusual situation. And we have to realize the wisdom of the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act, that we don't need to resolve all those. We can bracket them and proceed. That is, and in fact, in a divided society, a society that has a number of peoples collaborating, like Canada, French Canadians, French-speaking Quebecers, and English-speaking Canadians, Indigenous peoples, many Indigenous peoples. Claiming sovereignty, one, may in fact be counterproductive to the development of legitimacy in state institutions, disabling rather than enabling. I don't think anybody, or very few people in Canada, really would be proud to say that their country was founded upon the forcible subjection of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And unless you're going, and given that those Indigenous peoples have their own conceptions of the nature of political authority, the nature of legal authority, where it comes from, do we have any alternative if we don't want to rest upon forcible imposition, but to engage in a process of deep engagement with sovereignty 3? So that is, I think, where the action is. It has consequences for us. One of the things it does is it indicates how institutions of governments are founded upon structures of law. In fact, you can't talk about self-governance without thinking about the juridical traditions that sustain those structures of governance. It means that in settling these constitutional discussions, we have to take seriously the engagement with Indigenous legal traditions. And one thing that's happening at the University of Victoria, where until June 30th I was the dean, is that under the leadership of a number of our Indigenous colleagues, but with the support of many of the rest of us, well, all of the rest of us, frankly, there's unanimous support within the faculty, we've moved towards the creation, on top of our existing program, of which we're very proud, of a dual degree program that would teach over a longer period through intensive comparison, both Canadian law and how to engage with, access, reason with, build institutions upon the basis of Indigenous legal traditions within Canada. So a dual degree program in Canadian law and in Indigenous legal traditions. And that is our kind of small contribution to this process of engaging with a country founded upon a recognition that a country can work with foundations of legitimacy that reach to a multiplicity of legal traditions of the peoples that make up that society. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Jeremy, thank you very much for this. It's a particularly illuminating talk in many different ways. I have a couple of questions, but also I think maybe let's, maybe in a fairly open-ended way, let's start off with questions from the audience. And yeah, we have the first one. I'm also going to be doing this bad habit of checking my phone, but it's not for my usual WhatsApp messages. I just must clarify. But WhatsApp messages might be coming from people who are seeing this online. So yeah, so maybe what we could, if that's okay with you, if we take, say, about 3-4 questions, and then we'll list them out. Is that okay with all of you, or you would it's up to
That's
you
fine.
also.
No, that's just fine.
Yeah, and then you can sort of weave some of them together. It might make it more efficient.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I was just intrigued by several statements which you made, and I have several questions, but I'll confine myself to a few. We saw the reconciliation status, what the people say and what the government says of British Columbia. Now, in that kind of a situation, what is the point at all in the whole thing, whole process? And also, you did say that Parliament can always change the law. I mean, change the Constitution. And then my other point concern is, some years ago in the 80s or the early 90s, I used to be part of a campaign with the Inuit people against the testing, ballistic missile testing over their land.
Aha.
Okay, I remember that very clearly. And what I want to ask is, now you mentioned treaties which were signed. Who signed the treaties, on behalf of whom and with whom? See, what happens is, if there is an existing treaty which is not going to be honored by the present government or whatever it is, the present parliament, what is the point at all? And then you have indigenous people in several parts of Canada, different ethnic groups. Now, do they all share a common view, or they're all splintered and each one has their own concerns? And my last point is whether this kind of a thing is happening because of spread of education among the indigenous people, more awareness that their rights are being knocked off, or not sort of guaranteed or honored. Because we have similar situation in this country, in 2-3 states, in Odisha and Jharkhand and several other states, where the indigenous people are pushed out for mining resources which are locally available in plenty. Whether the similar thing is happening there, or is it they have more control over than what people in India have? Thank you.
Okay. Right.
We'll take one. If you can just introduce yourself and
Yeah.
then.
My name is Hem Chandra.
Hemchandra.
I used to be a peace activist.
Yeah.
Great.
I think you have to put on your mic and be a bit louder. And please feel free if you want to sit up front also.
Okay, is that better? Yeah. I'm Rochelle Pinto and I work on conceptions of land in Goa. I want to know how indigenous land rights manifest themselves, or indigenous law. Is it through custom or through practice, or is there any form of writing? And the other is there a hierarchy within indigenous societies where somebody might raise a claim against an indigenous authority, but it is from within a community, and how would that be articulated and resolved? And I guess one question is similar to the gentleman who just raised it, would be if there are conflicting interpretations of indigenous law between nations.
Right.
So it's not just the crown versus indigenous.
Yep.
Thank you very much for that talk. My name is Prashant Iyengar. I'm a doctoral student at Columbia, but I'm also a lawyer by training. I was very attracted to that notion of agonistic sovereignty that you laid out, and this notion of a layered sovereignty. I'm instinctively, just from my own knowledge of treaty making power in international law in the US and in India, I think I found your statement very compelling that this agonistic sovereignty is actually everywhere if you look at it. But I wonder if you would, what thoughts you would have. Because it seems to me that actually this very layered nature of sovereignty, you're absolutely right that it's historical and it's evident almost in every instantiation of treaty making power. But it seems to me that if you look at both the American experience with the Native Americans, the Amerindians, and in India, the British treatment of the native states, you would find that this layered sovereignty, this agonistic sovereignty, is precisely the means of the most intense form of domination. in the sense that the Amerindians, the Native Americans also were conceded absolute and unlimited power of decision in certain respects. And what respects were they? They had never was their power of sovereignty more granted and affirmed than when it came to their power to alienate their property. In all of the cases that involve, did a few people have the right to alienate their property? The Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court would absolutely affirm their right to. But in cases where, the question was whether the US Constitution owed any moral responsibility to any of them, the right to life, the right to determination, the question would be no, they are sovereign. So sovereignty was a way of evading responsibility, tactically. But also affirming power when it came to advancing colonization. And you see absolutely the same pattern in India as well. That is, in all of the treaties that you would see, the British power engaging with native states, they were given absolute power in certain respects for the purpose of evading British responsibility. So they had absolutely the power to terrorize and collect rents. But there was no reciprocal responsibility on the other hand. So so what I'm saying is that this seems to be what you're laying out here seems to be very consistent with almost a 200-year theorization of, or not theorization, but at least a practice of sovereignty,
right,
where sovereignty is tactically layered to advance power in some ways. So, I mean, I don't know, I mean, would you happen to have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So we'll start with this and then we'll have the next. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yep.
And then we'll have the next slide.
Okay. So I'll start with the first set of questions first. And I should say, I guess to start with one of the comments first, when you were referring to multiplicity of groups, were you referring to multiplicity of indigenous peoples themselves? Yeah, and there is a multiplicity of indigenous peoples. And indeed, that has been one of the challenges in being able to bring indigenous customary law within the law school without falsifying it, right? Without treating people. We do not take the position, for example, that all indigenous, there's a pan-indigenous law. The whole idea is to work with the law that is embodied within particular indigenous traditions. But that also means dealing with the complexity of law within customary legal orders, which not only differ between different First Nations, indigenous peoples, but also where there's the persistence of different interpretations internally. And I'll get to your question on that in just a moment. So, but if the question is, does this articulation of what's an issue in dealing with indigenous sovereignty capture what indigenous peoples are arguing for? I would be very happy to substantiate that in fact it is. That is shared across virtually all First Nations. I'll talk about exceptions in a moment. Virtually all First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. So what is the exception? The Mohawk within Canada have traditionally taken a stronger line towards an international sovereignty, a sovereignty that looks a lot more like Sovereignty 2 or Sovereignty 1 even, a kind of exclusive claim of determination. But first, not all Mohawk have made that argument. And indeed, even within the Canadian context, that the Mohawk really, it's not as though there aren't voices within Indigenous communities that do occasionally articulate Sovereignty 1, but that is certainly not the dominant discourse. The dominant discourse is, we want to operate by virtue of our own law. We want to we want to govern ourselves as Cree, as Anishinaabeg people. So although there is multiplicity, I'd argue that on the big questions, big structural questions that this is about, there's actually a broad degree of commonality. So what is the point of the recognition of the kind of dual authorities that we saw, for example here? You know, that recognition, and this in part comes a bit to Prasan's comment, but I'll deal with that more extensively in a moment. This was not given as a matter of grace and favor by the British Columbia government. This was not an initiative of the British Columbia government. This was the Haida people, who are a very assertive people, saying, we have these rights over this land, and we're willing to find some working collaboration with you, but don't think we're going to find a working collaboration unless you start acknowledging our inherent rights of government and our institutions and our way of doing things. And the detailed structure of land management that follows has that characteristics.
How long did it take for this reconciliation to take place? How many years?
Well, it depends, because there's a kind of long story, very long story. These negotiated agreements do take time, but they have been the overwhelming direction of policy within Canada. I'm not saying that Canada is perfect, so I'm not holding this out as perfection, but there's no doubt that Indigenous peoples have achieved greater acknowledgement, not absolute acknowledgement, but greater acknowledgement of their land rights, of their governance rights, of the fact that co-management structures like this one have to be built on the dual foundations of Canadian law and Indigenous law. In terms of the treaties themselves actually have constitutional force. They are protected by the Constitution, and so they can't just be changed. Once a government enters into them, they cannot be changed. To tell you the truth, that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it protects those treaties against being eroded by governmental action, but it also puts, as you might imagine, huge stress on those negotiations, because from the point of view of the Indigenous peoples themselves, they see these look like once and for all negotiations. So in fact, my own feeling is that, that we will see fewer treaties being concluded, and that instead what will be built up will be a foundation of more respectful, structured interaction on these issues of the kind like the Haida-Gwaii Reconciliation Act. Already there's a move in that direction, with Indigenous peoples being consulted and being engaged in major development projects. And there's a question of what degree of consent is required and how that consent might be manifested, but that certainly is the tendency. So now I don't mean to suggest that there are no conflicts left, right? This is not a model of how Canada does it perfectly. It's more a normative argument. In this kind of groping, partial attempt to grapple with these issues, what should we see as where this process is heading and where we ought to make it head? What's good about these processes? What's an issue in normative terms? Where does an appropriate resolution lie? How can we draw lessons from our practice for what we should be aiming at in our future operations? So that's the spirit. So it's not a claim that Canada has solved all problems. It manifestly has not. It is, but you do see these kind of this emerging pattern, and this is to pull from that pattern processes that are worthy of normative respect within divided societies. So with respect to the how Indigenous land rights are manifested, so this comes back to the nature of Aboriginal title to some extent, and that is that, so For a long time, Canadian lawyers, and in fact some First Nations, tended to think about the claim of Aboriginal title about securing control over the land in common by the people itself, as though it would result in full collective ownership vested in the nation of the lands. But if you look at the way in which relations to land occur within those peoples, it's not as though the entirety of the people traditionally owned had equal rights over the entirety of the land. Indeed, it's generally the case, overwhelmingly the case, that in Canadian Indigenous peoples, different familial groups, different kinship groupings, have responsibility for different portions of the land. There's a whole body of law held by the people themselves as to who has authority over what tracts of land and how that law is passed on from one to another. And often there are overlapping rights on that land. So for example, the Cree people of northern Quebec, people who are now called tallymen are seen as having responsibility for organizing hunting activities in hunting territories. They also have an exclusive right to take some species, but other people are entitled to cross those lands when they're going to their own territories. And as they do, they're allowed to take some species they are allowed to harvest. So there is this whole body of customary legal regulation of who can take what from the land, by what means, following what responsibilities. And that exists differently in different peoples across Canada. You asked whether it's reduced to writing. There are ethnographic accounts of this, but the Indigenous peoples themselves, especially once they acquire substantial governance rights, obviously want to draw upon that history even in the expression in legal instruments that they operate today. And in fact, our Indigenous Law Research Unit has been called in to work with, and it's directed by a person who's a member of the Saulteaux First Nation. It is itself Indigenous-led. Works intensively with First Nations to really pull together the law of that people as it bears upon a particular issue area on which they want to take action. And you can see the reports that some of the reports are held by, all of the reports are controlled by the communities. Some communities don't want that information made public, or they only want summary information made public. But if you if you Google UVIC, UVIC, ILRU for Indigenous Law Research Unit, you'll see a lot of those reports there, including a report on land management that was done in conjunction with the Sepwakam people. They're all done jointly. It really is, these legal traditions have been under severe pressure. A lot of the institutional structures through which they were operationalized and worked with were suppressed by Canadian institutions for decades upon decades. Some of you may have heard about the potlatch ban. That was a ban on a particular type of ceremony common on the west coast of British Columbia. Those ceremonies were exactly where the law was exercised and determined. And when you have those kinds of bans, you have an erosion of the law. And you have when the exercise of that law is displaced by Canadian law, you have demoralization, you have people not using it as regularly, you have it not known as much, not as transmitted. And so what happens in these projects is an attempt to pull together from diverse sources, including the people who are knowledgeable of that people's law within that community, the body of knowledge that has been used for land management, for example, within the people over time. So it's not written down in the sense of codification. Some people will want to codify, but that of course freezes the possibility of evolution. It also tends to choose between variant reading of the traditions, because there are variant readings within the communities. There are conflicting interpretations. And in fact, just like as we live in Canadian law schools or Indian law schools with a persistence of conflicting interpretations of legal principles, the same happens in Indigenous communities, but without the same type of institutions for settling that disputes, different ways of settling those kinds of disputes. There also is hierarchy and power plays within Indigenous communities. So the spirit in which our folks, the Indigenous scholars at our university, and it very much is accepted by the communities themselves. They themselves are come from communities, are embedded in communities, but the communities then come to them to work with them, and the spirit in which they work is that you have to approach Indigenous legal orders with the same kind of inquiring, rigorous, critical spirit that you bring to any order. And you have to be alive to claims being made that are simply power plays. So if you spoke to my colleague Val Napoleon and you said, isn't Indigenous law sacred? Something that carries real spiritual significance, which I have to say, I do accept. She would bristle at the use of the term sacred because she sees it being used too often as a way of resisting, of powerful people within communities stopping a conversation. So one of the things in our engagement with Indigenous laws is we realize that we have to internalize those debates within the program. Just as we try in any law school to internalize debates over the law and different interpretations of what is the foundational character of different areas of the law. And then to come to yours, Prasad, it is true. So let me make the question is a hugely important one. It is true that sovereignty the language of sovereignty can be used as a language of domination. And indeed, frankly, any form of co-determination holds out the possibility that one is being co-opted. So I've never dealt with an Indigenous student, of whom 10% of our students in the faculty and more than 20% of our graduate students are Indigenous at the University of Victoria. I don't think I've ever dealt with an Indigenous student who didn't ask, am I being co-opted in my study of Canadian law? Is this a compromise that I should not be making? How can I interact without losing myself? In fact, one of the reasons why I've thought that our law school was such a good place for Indigenous students to study is they get a range of answers to that from faculty members who are acutely concerned that almost any concession or accommodation or coming together is co-optation. To others who are more willing to engage in thinking through how the working together of Indigenous and non-Indigenous sources can improve the law for all. So that danger will always exist, and there are no easy answers to it for the simple fact that we can never step outside of history, right? We carry the burden of history whether we like it or not. We can't sweep away power relations and put in place and step into a world of perfect equality. Frankly, I don't think that world exists or could exist. We'd find something else if we did. So the only task is for the internal critique, for the engaging with internalizing that discourse of critique and evaluation and arguing internally over, is this an appropriate step? There's no doubt that the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act is seen by the Haida people as an appropriate step. Not enough, they continually are, but a good step. So, my sense is that if it is true, and I guess what I would ask is, what's the alternative to engaging in a pattern of co-determination? The sense that we could somehow order the world so that we had nothing but sovereignty, states of sovereignty one everywhere, is not. It's been tried with horrific results. It usually means acute and severe suppression of minorities that seem to be getting in the way of a project of a unified sovereignty. So, my feeling is that we have little alternative. Now, my sense is that in this, to be clear, when talking about sovereignty, I don't see this as being, like, layered sovereignty also, perhaps the best way to put it is, layered sovereignty also responds to, I think, something that is very common in the human condition, but that our political institutions often do violence to, which is that we often participate simultaneously and have allegiance simultaneously to multiple political communities at the same time, right? So at one and the same time, you participate in the political society that is Karnataka, and also participate in the political society of India, without in any ways those being in necessary conflict with one another. Those allegiances can be seen as being additive rather than in tension with one another. In fact, it's hard to imagine what India would look like without the kind of material regional diversity that also exists within India. Same is true in Canada. And we therefore have to, in this case, be concerned not just with how we imagine and how we build over time structures of governance that respond directly to Indigenous principles, but also how we structure those institutions through which we collaborate to govern ourselves together as a political community. So this reaches towards a particular form of layered sovereignty which is expressed within a federal principle, which can be structured in oppressive ways, but where I think it's a real mistake to presume that it's oppressive, because that leaves out a constructive engagement with the only form of relationship that has any future in a plural world.
We have several questions. And please put up your hand. One is Shruti, Karan, Varun, and I think, sorry? Rishika. In fact, I think you were earlier than Shruti, so we'll take you first, then Shruti, then Karan and Varun. And I also found something like 6-7 questions coming. They were sent to my personal WhatsApp ID, because right now there are 13 people who are virtually occupying some of these, 13 or 15 people who are virtually occupying these chairs sort of in this larger cyberspace. So there's a question from there. So, yeah.
So Haida Gwaii, it's probably a good model on many factors, but I think one factor where it probably falls short and cannot be the ideal example is because they are islands which are off the coast of British Columbia. They are separated, both the lands are separated by water. So one example I can draw on was Keystone. So when the idea came up, both the natives in Canada and in the US opposed it because it passed through shared land. So when you're living in the same space, the problems are more complex. When you're cut off by water, it's easier. I mean, I'm sure there are still complexities, but it's easier. So maybe in that way, this will not always hold up, because here you can agree to disagree very easily.
Yeah, that's, yeah, good point.
Do you have, you can do like, you just do like, you can just introduce yourself.
I'm Shruti Chavanti. I'm a practicing lawyer and a doctoral student in anthropology. I have two questions. One is, you started the talk by saying that India has been very instructive for you in your study of in your work in Canada. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the Indian experience has been instructive for you. And my second question is that you talk about these constitutional court decisions about, in this negotiation of sovereignty, about assumed sovereignty, asserted sovereignty, de facto sovereignty, right? So I was wondering I was curious about the mechanics of something like this, and actually Rishika's question maybe helps me understand just the simple mechanics of this a little bit more, because these are radical, it's a radical disagreement of first principles, which is very interesting because of the fact that in a context like India, for example, the way in which it would instantiate itself in civil law is about, like, for example, joint family property and market alienation, right? So you have, unborn generations have a right in property. So a sale can always be challenged by a claim from the future. And this has created a certain set of problems. One is it's supposed to be the historical problem with it has been this is anti-market, the institution of the joint family property, right? But in some ways it's also very pro-market, because I always encounter examples of how land can be released for further rounds of economic activity by mounting a joint family property claim on it. And there is a very interesting negotiation between two diverging first principles in the way in which it's negotiated within the court system. But what would the mechanics of that divergence of first principles, where would it play itself out if you have two entirely different modes of dispute resolution, right?
Yep.
I'm assuming that there is some middle ground that, there's always there's always a tussle over.
Yep.
But where does that middle ground, or the battle over that middle ground, play itself out in two radically different conceptions of sovereignty? So my question, in short, how would that constitutional question instantiate itself as a question in private law?
Hi, my name is Karan and I'm an intern here and a master's student in history. My question is more to do with the politics of it. So drawing from your fifth point, in terms of forming a political community, often the question is who negotiates for the political community.
Right.
And also, what does that do to the nature of the state? Do you end up calling a state with such radically different modes of governance, do you put it under the umbrella of a democratic state at the end of the day? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Varun, and my question was more on legal pluralism. In India, there's always this debate on. Okay. In India, there's always this debate on this uniform civil code,
Right.
that one master law, especially when it comes to Muslim women's rights. So it crops up in every election, and even now it's cropping up that there are these two positions that you can advance gender rights within the Sharia Islamic law, or you extend the uniform civil code in terms of marriage and other things. So I would like to know what of the Canadian context, and are there similar debates when it comes to gender and legal pluralism?
Yep. Good. Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, starting with Rishika's comment. And it is certainly true that it is easier to settle it on an island where the predominant population is Haida. In fact, that is experienced at a much broader plane within Canada as a whole. The modern day treaties have been much easier to resolve in northern Canada, the far north of Canada, where the population is sometimes often an Indigenous majority, and where there are no provinces. And so there's a unified federal jurisdiction to deal with it. So it is true that there are circumstances in which it's easier to do this rather than harder. And indeed, we ourselves have our, not only is Canada implicated in the Keystone Pipeline, but in fact there have been other pipeline disputes within Canada with different First Nations sometimes taking different positions. And so along the route of the pipeline, you'll have some First Nations or some portions of communities favoring the pipeline development, otherwise opposing it. And that those are particularly challenging, especially because there's a fair state impetus as well towards those kinds of developmental projects. So I don't mean to be suggesting that what I've said in this talk is a panacea for all those problems. It obviously isn't. What I would say is that it helps us at least to reorientate ourselves with respect to one particularly important aspect of it. What should we be aiming for in terms of the relationship between the different legal systems, the different ideas of governmental legitimacy that exist within Indigenous communities and within Canadian institutions? Do we have to settle the question of sovereignty one before we do anything else? Do we have to take seriously Indigenous legal traditions in their own terms, or can we just ignore them and treat this as a matter of pragmatic political negotiation? This helps with those questions, the question of orientation, asking the questions that we have to ask in order to do a better job of proceeding to deal with these questions. But you're absolutely right. The Haida-Gwaii Reconciliation Act is not a perfect or a final settlement. There's no doubt that the discussions are continuing. In fact, the Haida Nation just recently cranked back up their litigation for Indigenous Aboriginal title over the Haida-Gwaii. So they appreciate this result, but they have broader aims and desires and objectives. So it's not a panacea even in Haida-Gwaii, but it's an interesting and remarkable development for freeing us from some of the presuppositions that get in the way. You asked about whether I found the India instructive. Well, I find it instructive in so many ways, and I have to say that I am interested. So as a constitutional lawyer, I'm interested in the way in which constitutions ought to be adapted to conceptions of nationhood that exist within their societies, but, as you might imagine, also be open to a continuing contestation of conceptions of nationhood, because no country has a total consensus on those questions. So as a constitutional lawyer, I'm very interested at how constitutions should take account of linguistic difference, of other forms of cultural difference, how they should deal with, of the relevance of religion to national identification, and as you might imagine, all of those issues are hugely interesting in the Indian context, as they are in the Canadian context. I guess I could give one example that relates to this, and that is that you raised the question of personal laws and religion, Muslim personal law, Hindu personal law. And one of the things that I think that example has helped clarify for me is how we often talk about law as though it's sets of principles. And we leave out of account that actually law is dynamic. It's always evolving, it's always moving. It thrives on, or it ought to, a legal tradition that's healthy has arguments occurring within it, divergent interpretations, people engage with it critically, and that means that the institutions for change and reform and development also have to be considered part of the legal system. Not just a list of rules, but the institutions by which those rules are interpreted, applied, change over time. And one of the problems with the recognition of personal law in India, as I understand it, but you are the experts, is it tended to recognize the existence of personal law as though it were bodies of rules, but it, at the very least, dramatically simplified the structures by which those systems of law were interpreted, applied, changed. So a greater uniformity of those areas of religiously based law was imposed by the manner of recognition, and very often without mechanisms of change being built into it within the community. So you end up with a simplified and rigidified structure of personal law than would have existed within the religious traditions before recognition occurs. And that holds important lessons for, it at least identifies some of the pitfalls that are involved in certain forms of state recognition. It really points to the challenges of how to structure the interaction between state recognition and bodies of law that are carried by communities, in communities, and are much more fluid and much more dynamic and much more difficult to grab onto. The state likes things cut and dried, state structure. By the way, my approach to legal pluralism is not anti-state. I actually think that there are real benefits in terms of transparency and formal equality in state institutions, at least at their best. But I think we have to think about the interaction, not just picking which one we like. Pure imposition of a Republican legality does real violence to diversity within societies. So we do have to think about the interaction. You asked about the mechanics of this, and I won't go into all of them. Maybe just mention a couple of things that I think would help. One is that pick up on some of your own comments. By the way, you will notice that I mentioned the courts, and you referred to that I mentioned court decision-making and also constitutional discussions. But I should make it clear that I don't, one of the consequences of legal pluralism is that the state institutions are not the only place where the action is. It's interesting to look at them and to look at how they should adapt to customary law, but customary law, Indigenous legal orders persisted often in the face of persistent attempts of the state to get rid of them and to displace them. You know, they're carried by the Indigenous institutions themselves. And indeed, in the recognition of Indigenous customary law, one might well actually need to recognize those institutions as well, because otherwise you may end up dramatically distorting the structures. So it's not just that the state has the exclusive power to judge pluralism. It may have in its own eyes, in its own self-knowledge, or the self-knowledge of many of its participants, but it's also the case that Indigenous institutions are also judging the state. And you raised the question of family property being anti-market, and that I think does raise one more general question that I think we do need to think about. If you have a proliferation of institutions all having to collaborate in decision making, which obviously I see as in substantial measure a good thing, that's what I'm talking about here, I still think you could imagine the proliferation of consents required being so numerous that it's extraordinarily difficult to accomplish anything, right? There being all kinds of institutional disincentives to action. And I think we have to think about that issue. I think we have to think about how critique, reform, change can still occur. So we have to think not only about recognition of diversity, but we have to realize that that diversity itself is dynamic. And we also have to make sure that we have forms of dynamism built into our structures. And I think I've pretty much answered your question about who negotiates for the communities. With it, what are the things that happens in all of the projects that we do on customary law or Indigenous Law Research Unit does with communities? It's very common that from engaging with the substantive law in, I don't know, child protection, or in administration of water resources, or administration of land. The first project has to do with a specific issue like that, but almost always they then are pushed towards issues of governance. Who has authority within this social order for deciding between conflicting interpretations? By what processes ought one to work towards a community-based solution when there is disagreement? And so one thing that's going on in Indigenous communities is a process of determining what the modern expression of Indigenous institutions ought to be today. Many Indigenous communities, many First Nations communities, actually have kind of dual sources themselves. They have elective institutions that were created under the Indian Act, and those are sometimes treated by Indigenous scholars as being illegitimate. I actually don't treat them that way, and many Indigenous scholars don't. They have secured real legitimacy within the communities, but often with the same people who do see them as having value, also value traditional structures that operate through the feast hall or the longhouse. In some communities, that tension is debilitating, and the community splits over the tension between the elective institutions and the others. Other institutions find harmonious ways for traditional processes to interact with elective processes. And I do think that one of the processes we're seeing in Indigenous communities is a process of trying to think, how do we establish structures that are ones that are open, inclusive, participatory, and grounded in our traditions? What's the right institutional structure that perhaps avoids tradition versus band council kind of opposition? And then finally, with respect to legal pluralism and the question of the Uniform Civil Code, I already kind of talked about some of the foundations of that when talking about religiously based family law. I guess what I would say is this. There are similar debates in Canada. So for example, there was a debate over whether Sharia law could have any role in the resolution of family disputes within Canada. Really prompted by the fact that an Islamic council started using the arbitration system to handle family disputes, which incidentally, that arbitration system had already been used. It's a kind of a general arbitration system that could be used for commercial disputes, for all kinds of things. It was already being used by Jewish communities to take Jewish law into account in resolution of family differences, and by evangelical Christian communities. And I guess, I'd say two things. One is that and the people that I work with at the University of Victoria are keenly interested in having inclusive participation in communities and having a capacity for internal critique. And so one of the issues then is making sure that if one does have autonomous systems, recognition of customary law, that one brings the same kind of not necessarily the same standards. One has to be sensitive to the standards within the people, not expect the same institutional expression, but the same questions. How is gender being handled within that community? What's happening with people of other sexualities that are not heterosexual? How are they treated within? So there has to be an engagement, structures of engagement with those. And we also have to think about then how we sustain the broader political community that crosses those lines. And that may mean common institutions that aren't internally differentiated. So for example, there was a proposition at one point for defined Indigenous seats in Parliament. To tell you the truth, I didn't think that was a good idea. for two reasons. One is it's extraordinarily difficult to think how you would structure a system of representation when First Nations, there are so many First Nations who cherish their distinctness. But secondly, if one has a proper system of autonomous self-governance, perhaps it makes sense to have the uniting institutions operating on a basis that are manifestly inclusive and are on a basis of universal citizenship rather than distinctiveness. I give you one example. I've actually always been drawn to the desirability in the Canadian context of common schools and not been very much in favor of public funding for private schools, precisely because I think there's a value to Canadian society. And I should say, by the way, that's the side that I favor in that debate has been lost, right? There are lots of private schools in Canada. But I think there's something really beneficial of having all members of the community, having that diversity represented in schools as people are growing up. So they meet people of other communities, they learn about them, they learn who they are, they make friends across those lines. And people who are very wealthy are forced to come to terms with the existence of very poor people within their society. And to, like I think it builds a solidarity of citizenship, or at least an understanding that is valuable for the citizenry as a whole, rather than having people live separate lives with little encounter with others. So my view is that one has to pay as much attention to how we live together as to our zones of appropriate autonomy. So the argument that I'm making here is not one that's all focused on autonomy. It's also focused on how we sustain these societies and bring people together as well. So, and I would not presume to say whether a uniform civil code is an appropriate development in the Indian context. One has to always look out for supposedly uniform entities carrying a cultural imprint, and if that cultural imprint is significantly assertive and sufficiently objectionable for reasons that ought to be respected, then one may need differentiation. I think there's often a claim that common institutions are necessarily culturally neutral, but of course that's not the case. Law is impressed with culture. It occurs in a particular language or languages. It's influenced by sets of values that are borne by religious communities.
Okay, one last question.
Sorry.
We'll take one last question because
we are, I don't want to be, this to be a huge imposition on Jeremy, particularly because yesterday he had to give 3 such talks. So yes, and if you can just introduce yourself, and I'll just mention now that I have a whole range of questions which are coming both from the floor, but there's something like, I think 8 questions which have come from people online, and yeah, I'll have to, while you're sort of discussing, I'll have to think about how to address things, and maybe we'll put it up together in some form of I don't know, I'm looking at Vikas for ideas, but some sort of a web place, and then so that at least people who feel that they are online or watching me through that camera don't feel they've been excluded, and we'll try to sort that out, because it's the first time at least I've done this. So thank you. Yeah, so if you can just introduce yourself, and then.
My name is Nandakumar. My question is, I was not privy to what you said earlier. I came a little late, so I must apologize for that first. What is the status as far as the legal standpoint goes in the Canadian jurisprudence system of circumcision and genital mutilation of children, which some communities practice? Does the state look the other way, or does it condone it? Is it allowed, or does the state prosecute it?
So to tell you the truth, I'm not entirely certain. I know there have been discussions, and I don't know whether they found their way through to legislation, of having specific prohibitions on female genital mutilation. I don't know. There would be, depending on the circumstances, forms of prosecution that could be brought against the practice under aspects of the general law. But to tell you the truth, I don't know. It's not an issue that I've looked at carefully. And it's also an issue that has operated there's a real, I just don't know. I haven't looked carefully at it enough. I think a lot of times the procedures, ceremonies are actually done overseas. Even if they're done by people who are based in Canada or on children who are based in Canada, but I'm sorry, I really don't know.
Okay.
This is a very, it's a big thank you for Jeremy for spending time, and it's been an intense discussion. I think just before I close, and to be sort of at least fair to the people who've been online, just to run you through very briefly, I mean, we won't have time to respond to them, but just to give you a sense of how when people are reacting in the various realms. So there's been questions about powerful people and the issue of sacredness, the point that you mentioned about Val, bristling at the thought of that. Yeah. So something on that, something about where in the context of Chennai, where yes, you have some sort of a customary panchayats among the fishing villages, enforcing forms of governance, but then within the same system, the Chennai police takes over other spaces. Right. With regard to what's happening within the coast system. So in a sense, that there's a kind of complex interplay of what a village level a set of authorities and practices would do, but then they engage with other parts of the state, a set of questions around there. A set of questions around territorial rights and sovereignty, especially in the context of private property, and I think it maybe goes back to what you have listed up here, where you have private rights versus a range of other ways of looking at land and territory. A question about the category of indigenous in today's controversy, today's context of the recent controversy of genetic testing, and identity issues around that. And then I think a question again coming from Salil Sharirandan, because the rest I have some names that I don't have all, is the notion of dualistic co-determined sovereignty, especially its ramifications for resource and social sustainability, and how this plays out with disaggregation, and I read into Prashant's question earlier, or does this get into a play of sort of playing out a kind of a scenario of violence around that. I myself had a whole range of questions, so I'll have to add to this, and maybe one thing we could think about is that we just create some kind of space where we can list some of this out, and with some of your writing and also those of your colleagues,
That'd
so
be
that hopefully there'll be a space where people can I don't know, engage into further conversations, and maybe post some actual working material through which these conversations can go forward. So maybe that's one
Absolutely.
immediate idea I had. It's maybe not perfect, maybe you could think about it. But again, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, and those online, so patiently watching us and engaging through WhatsApp. So thank you all, and thank you very much for spending this time and also offering to make this talk. So that was really wonderful. Thank you.